Blake,
Abby,
let me see if
can you
I
hear me?
can make you a host.
I don't know if you can hear me, but I am not able to hear you.
Oh, hmm.
There we go. Cool.
So you can't hear me at all? Are you able to hear me any better now? Are you able to hear me any better?
You are able to kind of mute your. You should be able to mute and unmute yourself, or kind of raise your hand with the using the reactions. Put questions, comments into the chat as well. You can either do that on the right side of the screen, and then there's reactions on the bottom with audio and video options on the bottom too. But most of that's pretty self-explanatory. Just kind of finding your way through the different buttons, because I know every online system is just a little bit different. And then just a note, we are recording this presentation today. So if you do want to go back and reference it, or if you wanted to forward it to anybody that you know that isn't able to attend, please feel free to do that. We'll link it up on our website sometime after the presentation is done today. So the overview of the agenda for today, first, we're going to just give a general introduction to building performance standards as a whole, not necessarily specific to Oregon, but this emerging policy that is building performance standards that we're seeing kind of pop up in different places across the country in different jurisdictions. We'll look at Oregon specific House Bill 3409 and kind of go through the different sections of that bill and the highlights of it. We'll talk about what we plan for the rulemaking and stakeholder engagement process to develop our rules this year for building performance standards. And then the New Buildings Institute is going to walk through ASHRAE Standard 100 itself and kind of give an overview of folks. So if you're not familiar, our building performance standard is directed to use ASHRAE Standard 100 as a model for its development. So not everybody we recognize is keenly in tune and knowledgeable about that standard. So we thought this was a good opportunity to kind of go over the different chapters and the different sections of that standard to at least familiarize people with it as we go about and begin our rulemaking. And then we'll talk about closing and next steps. And then I'll just take an opportunity right now to mention, and there's another link to it at the end of my presentation, about a comment portal. So as we go along the way, we're going to provide a means for stakeholders to provide specific comments kind of for every stage along the way as we go through rulemaking. So there's a specific comment portal with some specific questions for today's presentation that we definitely encourage and welcome folks to submit any comments or questions that they have using that. And there's a link up here. There's also a link on our building performance standards page, the same place you went to find a link for this WebEx. There's a link for the comment portal there too. So definitely encourage folks to get in there and make comments. This is just our agency mission, vision, and what we do. Building performance standards, I think, fits really well with a number of the areas of what we do in terms of being a central repository of energy data, venue for problem solving, energy efficiency in existing buildings, providing any energy education, regulation, oversight, and energy programs and activities. So as we go along today, I think probably the most efficient way to handle it, just because we do have a lot to cover and I want to make sure we get through it all. If you do have any comments or questions, feel free to please put those in the chat. And then I think we'll hold all of those till the end and see what we can get to. Certainly we'll try to get to all of them at the end. And if there aren't any we're able to get to, then we can definitely follow up with people afterwards. But I think that'll be the most efficient and effective way to handle it. So definitely feel free to put them in the chat as we go along. So we'll start out just with an introduction to building performance standards. In general, building performance standards policies are an emerging type of policy that establishes a couple different things: specific performance levels that buildings must achieve in terms of like energy, greenhouse gas emissions, or some other metric, and then a time frame that they need to meet that target by. they're becoming an important tool for reducing energy use and emissions from the existing building sector. So we know that energy codes aim to reduce energy in new buildings and new construction, and building performance standards are meant to be complementary to those energy codes by addressing the existing building sector. And they're becoming more and more a key part of helping jurisdictions like Oregon meet climate goals. And they can be adopted by jurisdictions and applied to existing commercial buildings and multifamily buildings generally. This is a snapshot of BPS adoption across the country. You can see that a number of states and cities have either adopted a building performance standard that might be based on energy, might be based on greenhouse gas emissions, or it's under consideration. So there's a lot of different jurisdictions and cities and states that are either have adopted or are looking to adopt a building performance standard to address energy and emissions from existing buildings. In general, building performance standards include a number of components. So, those components range from scope, different performance metrics, targets, various compliance and phasing requirements, and implementation mechanisms. And I'll kind of talk about a few of these in detail. So as far as scope goes, the scope of a BPS policy defines the buildings that are covered by the standard. The process of developing that scope is often informed by the objectives of a specific jurisdiction, whether it's energy or greenhouse gas, and also by specific considerations for target setting in order to achieve performance targets that can be established for each covered type of building. The two primary factors that are considered generally by jurisdictions when establishing the scope of the BPS are the types of buildings to be covered, and then the size of the buildings, the threshold above which buildings will be required to comply with the standard. Types and sizes of buildings included in the BPS will have different impacts on the policy's ability to make progress toward a jurisdiction's goals, including a larger variety of building types and a lower building size threshold increases the total number of buildings covered, but it adds some administrative complexity and potentially adds more buildings for smaller buildings generally have less energy footprint and maybe less of an opportunity for reduction sometimes too. So more buildings, but maybe diminishing returns. So it's finding that balance and the right threshold of building size to apply. The building type. So when you're looking at a building performance standards policy, a building type is an important consideration too, and that's the building's use category, how it's used as an office, multifamily, hotel, healthcare, and that can be further divided into various subcategories to get even more specific. For example, medical office, type of office. And building performance standards are typically geared toward commercial and multifamily buildings, depending on which jurisdiction you're looking at, and generally aren't inclusive of things like single-family homes. And in terms of like building categorizations, there's a couple different ways to come up with different building categorization lists. And those are either like building categorizations that are in regulations such as building codes, or in other published sources like an ASHRAE standard, like an ASHRAE standard 100, ASHRAE standard 90.1, or sometimes building performance standards programs will look to something like Energy Star Portfolio Manager to define the building types that are included, and each have a specific target. And oftentimes, jurisdictions might have also implemented a building benchmarking policy, and it's helpful to tie and connect building benchmarking policies, building types with a future building performance standard to ensure there's alignment in building categorizations that increases the compatibility of data analysis and tracking tools to support the various energy efficiency policies within that jurisdiction. So the building size threshold within the context of a building performance standards refers to the minimum floor area of buildings that's included within the scope of the standard at each compliance period, and the date by which those buildings sometimes need to meet the target. Sometimes they're phased according to their size. As with the building type, the building size threshold selected for the BPS scope should be informed by the jurisdiction's goals for a building performance standard. Several of the existing BPS policies across the nation have been adopted and focus on buildings that are larger than, for example, 35,000 square feet or 50,000 square feet, with the rationale that regulating the largest buildings has the most impact while affecting a relatively smaller number of buildings. The smaller the threshold, the more buildings are included in the policy. The next phase, the next set of components of a BPS in general are the performance metrics that are chosen. And it's important to select that metric that compliance is going to be measured. It's a critical step for a BPS policy, and making sure it's directly tied to a jurisdiction's goals, whether it's energy reduction, carbon emissions, or something else. And in general, the metric is a quantifiable measure that's used to track progress on an attribute of the building. It's often derived from one or more measures using multiple factors, often like a ratio. Like, for example, site energy is often looked at as energy use intensity, and the metrics site energy usage, say in units of BTUs or 1,000 BTUs per square foot of building area per year. So there's some metric that's usually normalized or indexed to something like building size, occasionally indexed to some other factor as well, like occupancy or operating hours or something like that. The next important component for a building performance standard in general is setting the target. So after you've defined your building scope and the performance metrics, whether it's energy, site energy, source energy, greenhouse gas emissions, sometimes water is an option too. But after you've defined those performance metric, the next critical step is defining what the targets are, what performance level buildings need to meet. And having more granular building categories. So typically there's a separate performance target for an individual building type, an individual category, an individual climate zone. And having more granular building categories can be preferable because they provide an opportunity for more detailed target setting to differentiate buildings and different uses of buildings. And then it's very important to set technically and economically achievable performance targets that are aligned with jurisdictions' policies. And it's also generally preferable to set targets that are informed by benchmarking data, because benchmarking data reflects the actual current performance of buildings. Sometimes data is not available and there needs to be supplemental modeling or other analysis that's done to help establish those targets. But generally, to the extent that jurisdictions can use actual real building data to set the targets, makes the program more effective. And targets are typically specific to the building's occupancy type, sometimes weighted for buildings with multiple occupancy types, and are often normalized to things like square feet. As far as like compliance and phasing, that step of BPS development determines which buildings, like by type, by size, will be required to comply first, and how long the phase-in takes. In general, we've seen BPS policies phase in the largest buildings first. Jurisdictions typically start with those, and then sequentially lowering the square footage for compliance over time and phasing in more buildings at a smaller square footage, or maybe different types of buildings over time. And then implementation mechanisms for jurisdictions to involve creating a covered buildings list, just identifying all of the covered buildings in a state that are over a threshold and of a certain occupancy type can be a major undertaking, because generally those lists, as far as as they relate to like energy performance, don't really exist. So that can be a large task when you're talking about creating a list of potentially tens of thousands of buildings. Developing some sort of a compliance web portal, establishing a help desk, creating reference guidance materials, and delivering notifications to covered building owners. Building owners sometimes might be spread across the country or worldwide, and actually communicating and contacting the building owners of subject buildings in a state can be a task as well. And then just other program activities like outreach, training, education, and things like that are critical components of a BPS. So just to kind of review some of those critical components. In general, building performance standards require certain building owners to meet certain performance targets by a specified date. There's a number of critical key considerations that go along with BPS. There's aligning and establishing goals, how the BPS program and energy efficiency and greenhouse gas reduction from buildings fits within a jurisdiction's overall goals. Determining the covered properties, what property types, are there any exemptions and accommodations for things like financial hardships, things like building occupancies like industrial or agricultural uses. considering various compliance approaches. Is the compliance approach just meeting an EUI target? Maybe there's a prescriptive pathway as well. Maybe there's a conditional compliance pathway if a building can't get to the target but is taking steps to try to get there. Another key consideration, like I mentioned before, is providing support to building owners in terms of education, technical support. Some jurisdictions have incentive funding for early or voluntary compliance. There's also the potential to work with other partners or utilize other incentive sources to help get down to EUI levels to meet building performance standards. And then establishing reporting requirements, that are meaningful and achievable for building owners to report their energy and to document compliance. There are a number of benefits to building performance standards in general. So there's certainly reduction in energy use and reduction from greenhouse gas emissions to support jurisdictions for meeting their climate goals. Supporting local workforce, as building owners identify energy measures that are needed to get down to efficient levels of performance, that supports the local workforce and jobs to improve that performance through investment in energy efficiency measures and technology. One of the side benefits, the non-energy benefits of energy reductions and meeting performance levels involves improved comfort, improved heating, cooling, ventilation, lighting systems in buildings to use less energy and improve indoor air quality and comfort. And then, of course, when you reduce energy, you reduce utility cost and on-bill cost for building owners, and implementation of cost-effective energy measures to reduce the operating cost and energy burden of building owners and tenants. Oftentimes, BPS, building performance standards programs, will build upon an energy benchmarking program where you might see a jurisdiction or a state first start to track energy usage, and then based on that data that comes in and the analysis that happens afterwards, then a BPS, building performance standard program, might be established. And I mentioned this because, and I'll get into this later, the Oregon program defines Tier 1 and Tier 2 buildings, and Tier 2 buildings are directed to do just that, to benchmark first, with the ultimate evaluation in a few years to look at the potential for a full BPS and energy targets and meeting a performance standard for those Tier 2 buildings. But the first step is benchmarking for those Tier 2 buildings. And this is the approach that a lot of jurisdictions have taken, where first phase benchmark, second phase building performance standard. BPS programs are generally an iterative process. So for jurisdictions, first, the performance standard, the policy is established. Then within the compliance cycle, the first set of targets, the first set of, like, for example, energy use efficiency targets are set for existing buildings by climate zone, by type of building. They're set, the buildings make improvements if needed, evaluate options if they're not already hitting the target, meet the targets, submit their compliance data. And then using the Oregon legislation, BPS as an example, we're directed to reevaluate the targets every 5 years and potentially reset those targets, where you might set a target at the average building use from the start for the first phase, and then 5 years later, readjust and perhaps ratchet down or ratchet up that target based on the data that comes in and how buildings are doing. So it's an iterative cycle for jurisdictions to implement building performance standards, and they're usually set up in this manner to kind of cycle through performance over time, so that gradually over time, with each subsequent phase, buildings become more and more efficient. And similarly, it's an iterative process for building owners to comply with the building performance standard. This just uses a flowchart from ASHRAE Standard 100, which is kind of a building performance standard published by ASHRAE, and the Oregon process will be based on this one, but just uses this one as an example. So, first there's the process of implementing operations and maintenance programs, calculating your energy use intensity or your greenhouse gas intensity to figure out, okay, where am I? How do I compare to the target that's been set for my jurisdictions? Do I meet it? If yes, then the building complies, complete the compliance forms and documentation. But if no, then you engage upon this iterative process where a building owner might do an energy audit, prioritize, identify measures to help get to the target based on cost effectiveness, based on which ones can be done first, but generally identify what measures are needed to meet the target, verify that the savings are occurring, then the decision point is, are you now meeting the target? If yes, move on to compliance documentation. But if no, reiterate that process again. Maybe do a deeper energy audit, look at other options, look at other measures that perhaps weren't evaluated the first time around, and continue to cycle that around until the target's met. And that's kind of the general process cycle for building owners to meet a building performance standard. So that covers building performance standards in general, really nothing specific to the Oregon process. Although if you are familiar with what will be implemented in Oregon, if you've been tracking, you'll recognize a lot of components that come from the general building performance standard idea, concept, policy that's been included with the Oregon legislation. So the next thing I'll talk about is reviewing the specific House Bill 3409, that established building performance standards in Oregon. So they're part of 3409 that came out of the 2023 legislative session, meant to address energy use and emissions in existing commercial buildings. And it will require many large commercial buildings to enhance energy management practices and implement energy efficiency measures to meet energy use targets. And it's modeled after ASHRAE Standard 100. The program is administered by Odo, and it's modeled very closely after the Washington State program. Washington State's about 2 years ahead of Oregon in terms of their program design and implementation and compliance too. I believe the largest buildings in Washington will need to be phased in for compliance starting in 2026. So now we'll just take a quick moment to go over some of the highlights from the different sections of House Bill 3409. House Bill 3409 is a very large bill. It includes a lot of different energy and climate related policies, and building performance standards is really just one small section of that bill. It's sections 8 through, I believe, 17 in the bill. I think I just saw a chat question come in about these slides. Yes, these slides will be available on our website, along with a full recording of the presentation, but just figured I could answer that one right away. So I'll just take this opportunity to kind of just go through some of the highlights for each one of the sections and walk you through what's in 3409. In section 8 of House Bill 3409, it starts with providing definitions for our BPS. It defines what's a tier 1 building, what's a tier 2 building. I'll go into more detail later on those. But I did want to point out how it defines energy use intensity. Energy use intensity is defined as specific to the site energy use. So we sometimes also refer to source energy use, which refers to the energy use that it takes to generate, like, for example, the electricity at the power plant, and then bring that electricity to a building site. But site energy use is really just the building. If you draw a box around the building and the utility meters and meters, it's the energy that enters in at the site level. So generally what you see on the utility bill. And that's what Oregon's building performance standard will be designed around, and normalized, converted to units of thousands of British thermal units, BTUs, per square foot per year. And the bill does also define net energy use. So I just wanted to point that out as the sum of metered and bulk fuel energy that enters the building after subtracting out minus the sum of the metered energy that leaves the building. So if a building does generate and, for example, sends some metered energy to the grid, then that would be subtracted from a building's energy use to come up with a net energy use for the building. Section 9 of House Bill 3409 directs Odo, gives some direction to Odo for administrative rules to establish a building performance standard criteria, directs us to adopt rules for the BPS using ASHRAE Standard 100 as a model that first seeks to maximize greenhouse gas emissions from covered buildings, includes EUI targets for specific types of buildings, and offers a conditional compliance pathway. And if a building owner maybe can't quite get down to the target yet, but is making steps to do that. It directs us to develop specific energy use intensity targets that are not more stringent than the average energy use intensity. So this is the guideline that we're using as we're going about our energy use target analysis, looking at a variety of data sets, to determine what is the average energy use intensity across different building types. And our targets will be at or not as stringent as those targets, because that's the way it's defined in the legislation. And Section 9 also specifies that our rules may require utilities, eligible building owners, and other entities to aggregate data for covered commercial buildings that have multiple meters. So, there will be some buildings that have, where it's one building, but it has multiple meters that serve that building, where you need to aggregate the sum of all the energy use in order to generate a building-wide EUI. So that'll be part of our rules as well. And then when I talk about different building types, so there are kind of high-level building types that you can imagine, like education, entertainment, healthcare, offices, but then there's more granular levels. So just like within healthcare, you can have different property types. For example, on the right side of the screen, a hospital, a medical office, an outpatient rehab, physical therapy type, that all have sometimes significantly different energy profiles and different uses, where it is likely necessary to develop a separate classification and perhaps a separate target for those property subtypes. And the legislation directs us to consider occupancy classifications that are set forth in Standard 100 and the United States EPA Energy Star Portfolio Manager. A lot of people are familiar with Portfolio Manager, especially if you're tracking your buildings and entering them in, or have applied for an Energy Star score, for example. So I just wanted to show up here on the screen an example of some of the category types and property types that are available within Energy Star Portfolio Manager. Section 9 also directs ODO to create a database of eligible building owners and covered buildings based on county assessor records and other sources. So this is something that we're engaging with the county assessors to evaluate what data is out there to generate that covered buildings list, to filter for buildings that are over the thresholds and over the size thresholds and meet the occupancy types for Tier 1 and Tier 2 buildings, and then to notify those building owners by July of next year. So that's a process that we're engaging in. And Section 9 also specifies that local municipalities may adopt an energy performance or greenhouse gas emissions reduction standards that are more stringent or a broader application. So perhaps either a local jurisdiction like a city could adopt a separate complementary building performance standard to what's at the state level that maybe includes more types of buildings or has a more stringent energy or greenhouse gas performance metric that needs to be met. The next section of House Bill 3409 goes over the Tier 1 building owner reporting requirements, specifies that new reports are required every 5 years. It does provide a number of exemption criteria for types of buildings that are exempt from a BPS, and I'll mention those in a future slide. It requires ODO to develop a support program for providing information, periodic training, technical assistance, phone and email support to building owners to help comply. It provides the compliance timelines that are phased with the largest buildings first. And then it also defines civil penalties for non-compliance. I think I saw maybe a question come in the chat about what happens if a building owner doesn't comply. There is the potential for a penalty, for a fine, up to $5,000 or plus $5,000 plus $1 per square foot per year for non-compliance. Section 11 of the bill directs ODO to adopt rules that ensure timely, accurate, and complete reporting for Tier 1 buildings, enable our agency to effectively enforce the standard and the targets, and it provides a mean for affected eligible building owners to appeal decisions and enforcement actions. Say there's a fine that's applied, we'll be defining a process for appeal. And it ensures that eligible building owners are responsible for paying the cost of compliance, and not necessarily just passing those costs on to a tenant, for example. And it also directs us to consult with an advisory committee before adopting rules, and that process is kicked off. We formed the rulemaking advisory committee, and I've got a RAC schedule later on a future slide. And then Section 12 directs the county assessors to work with us, and at our request, to provide information about covered commercial buildings. Section 13 just talks about an annual report that we need to write to the legislature and governor's office about implementation of our BPS. And section 14 is where it clarifies that tier 2 buildings are not required to meet the energy performance standard itself, that they're required to benchmark but not meet a full performance standard. And that tier 1 building owners aren't required to act before we adopt rules, before we actually define what the requirements are. And then it also specifies that we may offer incentives for early or voluntary compliance with the energy performance standard. Moving along with different sections, section 15 of the bill. I know we're kind of getting like deep into just going through sections, not particularly thrilling, but I think important highlights of the bill, just if anyone hasn't taken the time to actually read through it, these are just some of the highlights. But section 15 is where it sets us with the requirement to finish our rulemaking for tier 2 buildings to benchmark their data by the end of the year, cooperate with the Oregon Department of Education on schools data, and notify tier 2 building owners by that same date as tier 1 building owners by July 1st of next year. And then this is where it also specifies that tier 2 building owners need to provide ODA with data to benchmark by July 1st of 2028 and every 5 years after that. And then the final two sections, section 15 and then 16 and 17, so final three sections. Section 15 is where it directs us to evaluate, after we collect that tier 2 building energy data, to evaluate and calculate average energy use, greenhouse gas emissions, and then by 2030, October of 2030, to provide a report to the governor and the Legislative Assembly on recommendation for a cost-effective energy performance standard. So that's where, we will be evaluating the potential for a full building performance standard for those tier 2 buildings in 2030. And then in order to do that, we'll be consulting with and forming a specific tier 2 advisory committee to help inform that process and make sure that we hear from all perspectives and all stakeholders as we're going through that process. And we're actually, if you took a preview at the comment portal that's up there for today's meeting, we're starting to gather interest in that tier 2 committee now, because we recognize that with this year's rulemaking, there will be tier 2 related rules with regard to how to benchmark tier 2 buildings. So we really want to get that tier 2 input sooner rather than later. We don't necessarily need to wait until July of next year to form that committee, even though we want that committee to be active into the coming years, into the future, as we evaluate the potential full performance standard for tier 2 buildings by 2030. And then section 16 and 17, I won't go into a lot of detail here, but those establish the incentives programs for early and voluntary compliance. We were given a small amount, a nominal amount of incentive money to provide to building owners for early and voluntary compliance that we'll be developing requirements for. So that kind of goes through the different sections of the bill itself. If you're interested, it's certainly available on OLIS, the Oregon Legislative Information System, if you wanted to read through those sections yourself. But this graphic, this illustration, shows how tier 1 buildings and tier 2 buildings are defined for Oregon. So whether or not you're tier 1 or tier 2 building depends a little bit on building size, but it depends more on building type. So commercial buildings, non-residential, hotels and motels over 35,000 square feet are tier 1 buildings. And then depending if they're over or under those incremental size thresholds, 200, 90,000, 35,000, will determine when compliance kicks in. Compliance kicks in for the largest tier 1 buildings, 200,000 square feet or over, on June 1st of 2028. 1 year later for 90,000 square feet or over, and then 1 year later for that of 35,000 square feet or over in 2030. Those sectors of buildings, commercial, hotels, and motels between 20,000 and 35,000 square feet, are tier 2 buildings that will just be required to benchmark their energy usage. So for those sort of buildings, 20,000 square feet or above will have something to do. But if you're between 20 and 35,000 square feet, you're a tier 2 building. So for a different sector of buildings, For multifamily residential, hospitals, schools, dormitories, and universities, any of those types of buildings over 35,000 square feet will be tier 2 buildings that will be primarily required to benchmark and report their energy usage, but not required to meet an energy performance target from the start. And then I'll just mention that if you're under those size thresholds, that you're not a covered building with regard to the building performance standard. And to just give people a general feel, kind of orient, frame of reference for what size of buildings are we talking about here when we talk about 35,000 square feet or 100,000 square feet. Your average Safeway store is about 35,000 to 45,000 square feet. So just in terms of like building footprint, if you're curious, that's about that size. If you've been to our agency's office in Salem, it's a 3-story building. If you count the basement, it's about 100,000 square feet. So the building's footprint itself is about in that 30 to 40,000 square foot range as well. And then your average Home Depot is about 100,000 square feet too. So just to provide a little bit of a frame of reference for magnitude of what size of buildings are we talking about here, that could be potentially covered. So the graphic gave an illustration, the graphic a couple slides ago, of what's a tier 1 building, what's a tier 2 building. This language is just the definition directly from the statute, so provides a little bit of just background. I won't read this verbatim, but it's there. This is the language. It's in the statute itself, in the bill. And then these are the requirements from House Bill 3409 with regard to when we need to set rules for these buildings. So this year we'll be engaging our rulemaking to set a building performance standard for tier 1 buildings and set a building reporting requirement for tier 2 buildings. And when you're considering compliance, so what does compliance mean for a tier 2 building? The most straightforward pathway for compliance is meeting the energy use intensity target. If you meet the target, the building complies. You have to report and document your compliance. But that's really the simplest or most straightforward pathway for compliance. There will also be conditional compliance pathways, like investment criteria type pathways that ODO establishes, such as, say, a building owner's done audits, made some energy investments, but hasn't quite gotten down to meeting the performance levels yet. There'll be a conditional compliance pathway for those sorts of buildings. And then there will also be eligible exemptions that are allowed under House Bill 3409, where maybe a building doesn't have a certificate of occupancy, or it has particularly low occupancy, and that's what that means is defined in the statute. If the total gross floor area after you subtract out the unconditioned and semi-heated spaces is under that 35,000 square foot threshold, basically unconditioned semi-heated spaces don't count toward total square footage, essentially, because they provide an eligible exemption. If the primary use is manufacturing or industrial, as defined through factory group F or high hazard group H, as defined in the building code, agricultural buildings and buildings experiencing a number of financial hardship criteria that are defined in the statute would also be exempt. But I did want to point out that these exemptions are not necessarily just like self-certified exemptions. These buildings would still be covered buildings, and they would need to be reported and documented within the system, within the framework of our BPS, apply for an exemption and be granted an exemption under one of these criteria in order to be exempt. So it's not just that, like, hey, any industrial building, a large industrial building is automatically doesn't need to pay attention to the BPS. They still do, and they still need to document their exemption. But it's just going through the process of doing that. I think there was a question before that I maybe saw flash, and I mentioned it before too, but what's a potential ramification of not complying? There is the potential for penalties, for civil penalties for noncompliance for building owners, and they may not exceed, so up to $5,000 plus $1 per square foot of gross floor area per year. So there is the potential for noncompliance penalties for building owners and for buildings. And you might be wondering, okay, there's all these building performance standards around the country. Some use ASHRAE 100, some don't. Why is Oregon using ASHRAE 100? It's directly in the bill. It's directly in our statute, directs us to use it as an initial model for an energy performance standard for covered commercial buildings. But there's a few other reasons, and there's a reason that it made its way into the bill. One of them is that I mentioned before, our building performance standard was modeled pretty closely after Washington State's, and it included ASHRAE 100 as its basis. Oregon also uses another ASHRAE standard, 90.1, for its energy code, references directly to that. So there's some complementary nature to having our BPS also based on another ASHRAE standard. For state-owned buildings, we've been referencing the ASHRAE standard 100 and the targets in it for some time too. So there's some experience with the standard itself there. Also, in general, all ASHRAE standards are generally under continuous maintenance, and they provide an established national framework for that maintenance and really get the benefit of the support of a lot of subject matter experts and a lot of resources that go into the committees that develop these standards. So they're very robust and have a lot of really expertise that gets embedded into the development and each successive iteration of the standard. And there was just a new version of that standard that was published just a couple months ago, that the 2024 version that Oregon will use as its basis. So the timing works out pretty well there, and it's customizable for Oregon's needs. We're working out a licensing agreement with ASHRAE to actually have it worked out to be able to take that standard, modify it for Oregon, and then offer it to Oregon users after that integrated version's established. So I've talked about the timeline, but in general, but here's just the timeline on a chart too. So this year we're doing rulemaking. I have to finish it by next year. We have to notify Tier 1, Tier 2 building owners by the middle of next year. Compliance phase-in starts for Tier 1 buildings in 2028, and then moves along each successive year down to a lower building size threshold. Tier 2 benchmarking is also required in 2028. And then we have to evaluate that benchmarking data by 2029. And then at around the same time, we'll be updating our Tier 1 targets in 2029, considering that we'll establish the first cycle of targets in 24. So 2029 is 5 years later, we'll be reevaluating some of those targets. And then in 2030 is when we'll have to report on a potential building performance standard for those Tier 2 buildings. And just a few other supplementary activities that we're doing this year. We're hiring staff to help implement our standard, going through a process of identifying the covered buildings, standing up incentives. We will be issuing a couple different requests for proposals to support our work, to help us set energy use targets, help identify covered buildings throughout the state, and then help us to engage community-led stakeholder engagement as we go through the process. I mentioned the stakeholder licensing, the ASHRAE standard licensing agreement that we have in place to be able to use that standard and modify it. We're going through the process of identifying and evaluating data and software needs. So when it comes to compliance and reporting, we'll need some way for building owners to document their compliance, and it'll be tied in through Energy Star Portfolio Manager, but we'll need also some software package to help us develop the kind of Oregon-specific BPS reporting and compliance. So there's options, whether that's developed in-house or some off-the-shelf software. There's quite a few off-the-shelf softwares there's some a couple of solutions that have been developed in the marketplace as we're seeing more and more BPS programs pop up. These software companies are developing solutions to meet those. So those are options that we're looking at. And then also, I mentioned before, but we do have federal grant support to help us implement with some of our partners too. That's really helping us along the process. So now I'll just talk a little bit about so far I've covered what are BPS programs in general, what is the Oregon BPS, how is the statute structured, what are the size thresholds, what are the targets based on. Now we'll just talk about the rulemaking and stakeholder process. And Wendy, if you're on, I'll turn it over to Wendy Simons with the Oregon Department of Energy, who's our rulemaking coordinator, just to go through a couple of these slides to talk about our rulemaking process in general and what's planned for the rest of this year and how to engage.
Great, thanks, Blake, and welcome everybody. Thanks for attending today. My name is Wendy Simons. Like Blake said, I am the rulemaking coordinator for our Planning and Innovation Division at Odo. So Blake and I have worked on several rulemakings together related to various topics. So I look forward to working on this one as well with him and with those of you in the public and on the rack. So just this slide just gives you a rundown of some of the major phases and processes that are part of the overall rulemaking process and some of our deadlines. So for those of you who are not familiar, the Oregon Revised Statutes, ORS Chapter 183, includes process and various deadlines for conducting a rulemaking. So we will be following all of those Oregon statutory guidelines and our administrative process. So the first step, once we have draft rules, the first step in the formal rulemaking process is to file a public hearing notice with the Oregon Secretary of State, which we plan to do in the fall of 2024, possibly toward the last week of September is our goal. Our public comment period will run for about 4 weeks, and during that public comment period, the draft rules will be available through the Secretary of State, and we'll also link to them on our websites, and we will make various means for available for people to submit their written comments on the rules. We plan to hold a public hearing in October or November. Most of our public hearings over the last few years have been remote. So you can call in or use a similar platform, most likely WebEx, like we're using today, and submit your comments or ask questions orally, as well as any written comments. So you can submit comments both ways if you wish. So Odo staff will review any public comments that we receive, and we may make revisions according to those comments to the draft rules before we complete our final rules. Then we will do an internal review with our management and get the approval of our director, as well as checking the draft rules with the Department of Justice. And then we plan to file our final rules with the Oregon Secretary of State by the end of 2024. And there's a link on this slide for the rulemaking webpage, the Odo rulemaking webpage specifically for building performance standards. So next slide, Blake. Great. So Section 11 of House Bill 3409, which Blake walked you through earlier, contains a provision directing Odo to establish and consult an advisory committee and before we adopt rules. And here's a list of the various interests that we must include on the advisory committee, including the last bullet, any other stakeholders that we identify as needing representation. And I would note that this same rulemaking committee is also mentioned in House Bill 3409, in that we must also consult this committee anytime that we amend the rules. So we must consult them when we adopt the initial rules, and then also anytime that we amend those rules in the future. So next slide, Blake. So here are some timelines, including the meetings, our scheduled meetings with the Rulemaking Advisory Committee. We had a kickoff meeting with the group in February, and then we've got today a general stakeholder meeting. We've got the meeting set up in a cadence so that we will have a Rulemaking Advisory Committee to dig into the issues, and then we will have a general public stakeholder meeting so that anybody who is interested can can come and learn about and give some feedback on the ideas and proposals that we've come up with through the RAC process, or Rulemaking Advisory Committee process. And then down in the bottom is a table just in a graphic form for some of the deadlines that I just talked about for filing the draft rules and the hearing notice with the Secretary of State, the public comment period, holding a public hearing, and then filing the final rules. So that's our goal. And we tried to build in just a little bit of wiggle room in case we have any delays, but we're hoping to hold to that schedule. So I think I might be handing it back over to you now, Blake.
Yeah, thanks, Wendy. And then I'll just mention here too, while we're still on this slide, that we do plan on offering like a separate comment portal for each stage along the way. So there'll be like a separate opportunity to comment if we're covering certain sections of the rules at, say, like the May public stakeholder meeting. Then the July one, there'll be a separate comment portal with individual unique questions that cover that topic that we'll be looking for feedback. So those will be comment portals that'll be open and up on our rulemaking website as we go through the process. So certainly encourage and welcome people to engage through those comments.
Yeah, and just I would add that the comment portal is often a useful way after people have heard all of the information at the stakeholder meeting and get a chance to, read any materials that are sent out and hear comments and then think about it, so that you might have a little bit extra chance to digest and come up with some comments that you'd like to share with us. So
yeah, thanks. So, what are we going to cover? So we talked about the rulemaking schedule. What's going to be covered under the rulemaking this year? We'll be setting the energy performance targets for different types of buildings. We'll be going through like energy management requirements, potential modifications to ASHRAE Standard 100 for Oregon-specific requirements, the conditional compliance pathways, various reporting criteria, procedures for documenting compliance, data aggregation for buildings with multiple meters, the incentive structure, and then just other administrative requirements. Our rules will be structured very closely to the outline and format of ASHRAE Standard 100. So if you open up that standard, there's different chapters for definitions, compliance, energy management plan, operations and maintenance, targets, and each one of those chapters in the standard itself will, our plan is to basically create an administrative rule chapter that's similar to that outline. Washington's, this is just using the state of Washington's example, which is also based on Standard 100, had a similar framework where their sections of administrative rule are each based on the chapters and the sections of ASHRAE Standard 100. So our plan is to do something similar. And what's in the standard itself, the language of the standard, after we met as Standard 100, after we modify it for Oregon, will essentially become the Oregon rules. So our plan is for the rules to follow that same general structure as ASHRAE Standard 100 2024 version, similar to Washington State's. Here's a link to Washington's if you wanted just to look it over to get a preview of what Oregon's might look like. We do recognize as we go through that some chapters are going to be straightforward and non-controversial, while others will be more involved and require more discussion. So as we go through it, we'll try to identify those areas and plan more time and more input opportunities. And with that concludes my section and Wendy's section of the presentation. Before I hand it over to Sean Denniston with the New Buildings Institute to kind of walk through ASHRAE Standard 100, I'll just mention again that we've got the comment portal open. And these are the questions that we've asked with this first round, just to kind of give you a preview. So, one, we've kind of shaped the questions to kind of mirror the agenda today, but do you have any general comments on building performance standards and their planned application in Oregon? Do you have any comments on ODA's planned process for stakeholder engagement for rulemaking through the Rulemaking Advisory Committee and general public stakeholder meetings? Oh, I didn't mention it before, but the Rulemaking Advisory Committee was made up of certain sector, certain representations, certain perspectives, as defined in the bill. There were six different categories that needed to be included in the RAC, but we've got a broader RAC than that. I think we have about 14 or 15 members on it, and kind of expanded it a little bit to include a number of different perspectives too. Those rulemaking advisory committee meetings will be open to the public to call in and view if you'd like. But then Wendy mentioned it before, we will be kind of taking the output of those RAC meetings, one RAC meeting or two RAC meetings, and consolidating it, and then bringing that output and kind of what came out of the focused RAC meetings to the general public in a future broader public stakeholder meeting. So certainly welcome to attend the RAC meetings and listen in, but know that there'll be another opportunity after that for more input through the general public meetings. But do you have any comments on our planned process for stakeholder engagement? Do you have any comments on ASHRAE Standard 100 2024 at this point and its application for Oregon? And then the last question is, are you interested in being involved on an advisory committee for Tier 2 buildings? So those were the multifamily, schools, hospitals, dorms, and universities. And if so, please provide which sector and organization you represent. And we'll be taking those comments as we form that Tier 2 rulemaking advisory committee. And here's another link to the comment portal too, which is also up on our website. And with that, that concludes my section of the presentation. So I'll stop sharing my screen and see if Sean, if you're able to take over sharing at this point.
Sure. Thank you, Blake.
Yep.
We will do the standard shuffle.
Yeah.
Make sure that you can see and the right thing.
We can hear you. Yeah, just fine.
So that's a good, right. So are we seeing the right thing?
I think so. Yep, I see your title slide.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. So my name is Sean Dennison. I'm an Associate Director for Codes and Policy with New Buildings Institute, and we are helping out with this process of turning this BPS legislation into actual policy that is enacted in the state of Oregon. And my role here today is to give an introduction to Standard 100, since it plays such a big part of this policy, and it is mentioned specifically in the legislation for adoption. And so we want to introduce this group to the standard, what's in it, and what it entails to adapt this for Oregon's use and Oregon's building performance standard. So we'll start with an overview of ASHRAE Standard 100. We'll talk about some lessons learned from Washington's adaptation of Standard 100 for their statewide BPS. And then we'll talk a little bit about the specifics and what this means for Oregon and Oregon's use of Standard 100. And I think one of the things that we want to start with is that many of you are probably familiar with Standard 100, or you might not be. But up through the 2018 version of Standard 100, it was really focused on providing a tool directly to building owners for how they can manage and maintain their buildings to achieve certain energy targets, certain levels of efficiency in their buildings. However, it became quickly evident that a lot of what was in Standard 100 was very useful for jurisdictions that are looking to adopt a building performance standard. So in 2024, we see a shift. A lot of modifications were made to ASHRAE Standard 100 to make it serve that purpose better. But as we're going through this and looking at how we can use Standard 100 in Oregon, you can see that there are still a little bit of this dual identity in the 2024 version. So that even though now, the stated purpose of Standard 100 is to provide a code-ready building performance standard, it still has a lot of these elements from that older life as a way to really provide for the maintenance and operations of existing buildings and that old target of building owners. So as we look at the transition to 2024, we can see that there are a bunch of modifications, including a revised scope that includes BPS elements. We see the addition of greenhouse gas metrics and targets, since so many jurisdictions are looking to go that direction with their BPSs. An appendix that's added to guide custom target development, which will be very relevant in Oregon. And US regional energy conversion factors, so some more technical content, a prescriptive path for buildings that don't have EUI targets, which is something that can be very important for BPSs. And then of course, updating all of the EUI targets based on new data from the Commercial Building Energy Consumption Survey, that's what CBEX means, and the Residential Energy Consumption Survey. So that's residential buildings. So updated targets, since the targets in the older editions were based on some older data, and then some additional building types and climate zones. So we see these kind of general advancements in the standard, but then these expansions that really make it work better for a BPS. And so we're going to go through and really see what is in there. What's the meat of the standard? You can see here, this is pulled straight from the title, the table of contents. These are the main sections that are in the standard. And then there's a whole bunch of appendices. Some of them are normative, you'll see that on the first three, and some of them are informative. Normative appendices are appendices that are considered part of the standard. So when you adopt the standard or when you use the standard, these are really considered integral parts of the standard. And then the informative ones are providing additional information to anyone who's using the standard. However, since Oregon is adopting this, Oregon has the flexibility to choose which of these appendices get adopted and how they get adopted. Now, going back to the main body, you'll see that some of these sections are really core to the nature of a BPS, like we were talking about before. And so we've highlighted them here: the purpose, the scope, the definitions, the compliance requirements, energy use target requirements, implementation and verification requirements. Well, some of the other sections, while are very useful to existing buildings and could be a good part of a really robust BPS implementation, are maybe a little bit less core to using ASHRAE as a building performance standard. And we see the same thing in the appendices. Some of them are really core to using the standard as a BPS, and some of them are useful to using the standard as a BPS. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the ramifications of that as we go through. So I want to just note one thing early on, which is definitions. Standard 100 has definitions, and some of these definitions are really important and need to be reconciled with Oregon's legislation to make sure that the terms are defined the same way. But we have some of the ones that a lot of people are probably used to, have seen before: energy use intensity, EUI, or EUI target. However, it has other terms that are really about how a BPS operates, like a qualified person. This often becomes a really critical piece in how you implement a BPS. Who is qualified to do certain tasks? And so we also have definitions like these, and might have to modify or even add additional definitions to be critical to, they play a critical role in making sure that the BPS operates smoothly. And we'll just kind of keep going through section by section so that you can see what's in there. We will not be reading text, but I want you to see what the text looks like. So as we get into section 4, it's compliance requirements. So what's in this section? It's really wayfinding. It tells you which buildings comply with which requirements. Now, Blake gave you a really good breakdown of tier 1 and tier 2 and the timelines. That's the sort of information that would generally be found here in this 4th section. It tells the buildings, it'll lay out, what is the building threshold for size, what are the building types, and which of the requirements throughout the rest of the standard will actually have to be, those buildings will need to comply with. So it's you can almost see it as the wayfinding, the traffic cop that sends you through the various sections. Section 5 is an emissions and energy management plan. Again, you can see, nice dense text that ASHRAE likes to make, but really what this comes down to is requirements for a plan for how you're going to measure, monitor, and document your energy and emissions over time. So this is your plan. You almost might think of this as your plan for being able to do your submittals for the BPS requirements, how you're going to get all that information together, We had a question earlier about how do we handle tenants in multifamily buildings? Well, that would be part of your plan, how you get that information that you need, and then what you'll have to go through for your compliance and submission. So it really is the plan. It's forward thinking. This is the sort of thing that you would put together before you did your actual documentation and submission. Moving on to section 6, we have operations and maintenance requirements. These are requirements for not how you get the information, but how you're going to use the building, how you are going to structure your operations and maintenance activities of the building to optimize your energy performance with the intent that's implied here of meeting the requirements of the BPS. So this is where you would put your plans for, well, we know we're going to need to upgrade something because our performance isn't there. Or we know that we're going to need to do some retro commissioning because our equipment should be operating better than it is. And so we need to really get that performance in line. And looking at this long term and looking at the BPS target dates to make sure that it happens in time so that you can meet those targets that you need to in time for the deadlines. So it really is forward thinking. This is how we're going to run our building to meet our targets. And this is what we're going to do to our building if we need to make modifications to bring that performance to a level that meets the BPS targets. The next section is energy use and GHG target requirements. This is kind of the meat of things really for a BPS. Really what it comes down to is this is where the targets live. But it's more than just a table of numbers that you would look at because there's lots of special situations when you're doing this. The target's going to be different by building type. Sometimes you're going to have buildings with more than one use type inside of them. And so how do you do that blended target that reflects multiple uses within a single building? Whether there's going to be any adjustments that are allowed for vacancy in the building, for schedule, for occupancy density. So any kind of normalization that might be part of the BPS, that would be included in this section. So this really gets to the nuts and bolts of what are the targets that you will need to meet and how do you do those calculations. Now moving on to section 8, this is the energy audit section. So Standard 100 is set up, so you saw that diagram that Blake showed earlier that, all right, you know that your building performance is not where it needs to be, and you need to do something about this. This gets back to that operations plan. Well, you need more information than just, we're using too much energy. Why is the building using too much energy? And so this section lays out a procedure utilizing, an energy audit and what that energy audit needs to include to be able to determine what it is and why it is that a building is performing the way it is and where those opportunities for improvements actually be. So it lays out the requirements for the audit itself. It lays out requirements for who can do the audit. Again, this comes to the who can do certain tasks information again. And then in the 2024 version of this, it gets to not just energy use, but decarbonization, which is really big on a lot of people's minds, even though Oregon's BPS is based on energy use and EY instead. And then next section, we are looking at implementation and verification. And this section includes requirements for energy efficiency measures to demonstrate compliance and requirements for energy auditors verifying energy efficiency measures. Earlier, you saw Blake talk about and show this idea of compliance alternatives. And so what this really lays out is a series of requirements, prescriptive requirements that might be the way that you demonstrate compliance, where you do this, this, and this, you improve your envelope this way, and your lighting this way, your HVAC this way, and then that demonstrates compliance, even though historically you haven't actually met the requirements. This can really help with the timing of when a building needs to show compliance with the BPS. And this is one of those sections that could be really useful in implementation of a BPS. When we look around the country, some jurisdictions have this as a way to comply with the BPS. Other jurisdictions don't. So that's why this was laid out as one of those sections that's really useful, but isn't kind of core necessity to the nature of a BPS. And then section 10 is residential buildings and dwelling units. Now, it's really important to note that when Standard 100 says residential buildings and dwelling units, it's not talking about multifamily. This whole section is really a consolidated set of requirements from all the previous sections, almost like a repetition of them, that are meant for single family homes and looking at a single dwelling unit, so a single tenant unit within a larger building, like a multifamily building. So when we're thinking about multifamily buildings, that doesn't fall under this section. That is treated just like all the other buildings in the other sections. But if you were in a situation where you're looking at just a single dwelling unit, then you would use this section. If we had a BPS that applied to single family homes, then you would look at this section. So it's really easy to get hung up on the name that you might think, oh, this is the section I go to for multifamily. But this is one of the sections of the BPS of ASHRAE Standard 100 that probably would not be included in Oregon's implementation just because of what it's meant to cover. I want to pause now because I think some questions were coming through chat, but when I am presenting, I'm not able to see the questions. So Blake or someone else, if you wouldn't mind, if there are any questions right now, I think this is a good pausing point. We can answer a few questions and then we can move on. Or does that mean there aren't any questions or they've already been answered in the chat?
Like, it looks like you're still muted.
There we go. There we go. Sorry. Thanks. We can double hit it. I'm actually going through now and trying to respond to some of the questions that came in during my part of the presentation. So that might be what you're seeing pop up.
Okay.
So apologies if that's distracting. I don't see any specific questions.
All right. Well, we'll continue to pause
Yeah.
as we go through the sections. I want to make sure that we are answering the questions as they come through, and it's not distracting to me, so don't worry about them coming through. I just want to make sure that we're not missing questions and we're not and that we're not giving the answers that people need. All right. So this takes us through kind of those main sections of the standard. And now we're going to look at what's in some of these appendices and the role that they might play in Oregon's implementation of a BPS. So again, we have these sections that are more central to the implementation of a BPS, and we're going to focus more on those sections. So of course, forms, I think Oregon is going to adopt its own way of doing compliance, but you can start to see the types of information that would need to be submitted through any kind of BPS submission process. But it's nice to be able to see the types of information that are likely to be there. It has this great table for a timeline. This is another way of thinking about that diagram that Blake was showing earlier about what steps you would go through to actually walk through each of these sections and do the things that you need to do to get to the level of performance that you need. This is Appendix D, has this timeline in it. Things simple like climate zones, because the reality is that in Oregon, we have 2 climate zones, and those climates can actually be very different, which necessitates having different targets for these different climate zones to reflect these different climates. It may not be vastly different, but these are the sorts of things that we need to look at. And you can see that these climate zones pretty much follow our county boundaries, and these are already laid out in Standard 100. This section, Appendix J, which is guidance for locally derived building performance targets, is something that'll be very useful in Oregon's implementation, since we are looking at how we can set targets that are really appropriate for Oregon. You'll notice that I mentioned earlier that the targets that are in Standard 100 are based on these big national data sets of performance. And as a result, they're not always extremely regionally specific. And the data in some areas might be a little bit thin, or it might not be really specific to the actual buildings that are in those jurisdictions. And so there's an opportunity to go through and how do you use the data that you have available for your actual jurisdiction, for the area that you're covering, and how do you use that to create your own targets. So it gives an example of and a process. Say you have, here's a bunch of buildings. For however you got your data, you have a bunch of buildings that you can use as your data source, and you can look at some details about the data, and then how do you turn that data into targets and what that means for the buildings that you surveyed. So here's an example of, we had these 7 buildings, and if we set the target at the 25th percentile in site EUI for those buildings, what that means for the buildings, that some of them will need to do a reduction. Some of them will already comply. Some of them will need to reduce a lot. And it lays out this whole process for both collecting, analyzing the data, and then also assessing the results of what happens when you set your targets at certain levels. So that'll be very useful for guiding Oregon's process. Appendix H is where all of those energy efficiency measures that we talked about earlier actually reside, or in the appendix. And so we really do have a full array of measures that are already built into Standard 100 and available: envelope, HVAC, refrigeration systems, water systems, energy generation, non-residential lighting, residential lighting, electric systems and motors, and appliances. So a broad array of measures that can be leveraged as part of a BPS compliance process. And then I think Appendix M is one that can be really, really useful. It's guidance on building type definitions, because when you really think about it, we call lots of things offices, but a lot of our offices behave very different from one office to the next. It's one thing to have an office that is a law firm, which is very different from an office that is actually a medical office. And this provides breakdown of how you can align some of these subtypes, which is how you might think of the spaces in your building, with the building types that are used in Standard 100. Any of you who have used Portfolio Manager will find these very familiar, because these are basically based on the EPA building types and subtypes that are used in Portfolio Manager. And they're also used in the CBEX building survey. So all of those building delineations that were used for that big national data survey of energy use that went into ASHRAE Standard 100's original targets are also aligned with this as well. And that's kind of our basic overview. You saw from the sheets, when I showed you the actual text, that there's really a lot there. And for code wonky people like me, there's a lot to really dig your teeth into. But we wanted to give a general overview for this stakeholder group to be able to see the sorts of things that are in Standard 100 that we'll be working from as we implement it as part of Oregon's BPS. And I'm going to pause for if there are any questions on this section before we move into lessons learned from Washington's adaptation.
If there are any questions for Sean, feel free to put them in the chat.
All right, then we will just go ahead and move on. So let's think about some lessons that we've learned from Washington's adaptation. I think one of the things to start with is if you look at Washington State's adaptation of Standard 100, in that subtitle, there's an important detail, which is that Washington was based on the previous version of ASHRAE Standard 100. And so while Washington's implementation of Standard 100 provides tons of lessons learned for us, if Oregon uses 2024, 2024 has already incorporated a lot of the lessons learned from Washington. Maybe not all of them, but a lot of those. That process of adapting Standard 100 for Washington really fed into the 2024 modifications for Standard 100. So a lot of things that Washington had to do to make Standard 100 work for their BPS will hopefully not be necessary for Oregon going through the same process. So let's look at the types of modifications that they made. Starting based on ASHRAE Standard 100 version 2018, they did extensive modifications. one of the big ones, and this is one that we'll need to pay attention in particular in Oregon, is incorporating a structure for tier 1 and tier 2 buildings. So adapting requirements for different buildings at different times, which is something that's really not built into Standard 100. I think it's important to note that it keeps the operations and management requirements. It also keeps the energy plan requirements. It also adds an investment compliance criteria, which we'll talk about in a second, and specific reporting requirements that are specific to Washington and how reporting is going to happen in Washington. So I'm sorry this is a little bit fuzzy, but you can see how they handled some of these sections that, they did not adopt section 10, which is that residential buildings and dwelling units, for the same reasons that Oregon is not likely to. They didn't adopt many of the appendices, and then they added these normative, they called them annexes because that was the name back then, but they are just called appendices now. And what adaptation means, we looked at what some of that raw standard text looked like in some of those previous slides. And here you can see, blue text of Washington had to make fairly extensive edits to the text of Standard 100. And that was replacing pieces from the text with new language to really make it work for them. And, so the lessons that we've learned from Washington, really that high level, is that you can't just adopt Standard 100, you have to adapt Standard 100 to your specific needs, that it does take getting into the text itself, and that using Standard 100, that there are parts that you might leave behind because they're not relevant to your use of Standard 100 as a BPS. And so that really gets into what this means for Oregon's process. We've heard details about what Oregon's process is going to look like on a more of a schedule basis and a high level basis. When it comes to actually digging into adapting Standard 100, that's what we're going to talk about next. And really, one of the big questions is going to be starting with which sections are kept and which sections go. It's almost certainly section 10 is going because that's just not part of the legislation that we're working from. But we do have these other sections that are, well, could be really useful to the implementation of a BPS, maybe aren't as core to the implementation of a BPS. So which ones does it make sense to keep in and which ones might it make sense to leave behind? And this is one of the things that our process is really going to be working to determine. But even once we decide, okay, this is a section that we definitely need for Oregon's BPS, then there is the question of, well, which parts of the section of this section stay in? Because, for example, here is section 7. This is all about the targets, really core to a BPS. However, there's whole sections that are about source energy and greenhouse gas intensity. And that's really not part of the way that the legislation for Oregon is structured. And so very likely, all of this text that is related to these would go. With one caveat that Blake did mention that there's the opportunity for local jurisdictions to go further than the state BPS. So some of this might be relevant to local jurisdictions as they're looking at how they can build upon what the state is doing, but we're looking primarily on how the state is going to approach this. So there's going to be sections that'll need to be taken out, and then there will need to be sections that might need to be rewritten, aligning the language with the legislation and with the lessons learned from the stakeholder process and from the technical development of the experts who are working on this and the community that's engaged. So making changes to the language. There might be sections that need to be rewritten to really make them apply to the way that Oregon is using this. And that adaptation process is really going to be core to how ASHRAE Standard 100 is implemented in Oregon. And really want to make that as being one of the big takeaways from this. We have this tremendous resource for use in Oregon. Standard 100 has a tremendous amount of content that is very useful for implementing a BPS, but we can't just adopt it as is. It really has to be adapted to align with both the realities and the needs of Oregon. And we'll pause once again for any questions. I will stop presenting so that I can actually see them. And Blake, are there any that you would like? I'm just now looking at them, so I want to see if there's any that need my attention.
Maybe not specific to your presentation, but about ASHRAE Standard 100 in 2024, will there be a link on our website for a copy of the standard? And I think I saw another question about, so ASHRAE does offer their standards for a free read-only version, but I actually noticed that the most recent version of Standard 100 is the 2018 version up on their read-only. So I would expect that it'll be up on their website on their free read-only. The newest version sometime soon. I don't know exactly when.
I don't know the timing either. However, I do know that it is complete. So it is in publication version. I mean, we are in 2024. So this is actually a case where the version of a standard is available in the year that is in its title. I know that full versions of them are out there, but they are under restricted use right now. So I am a non-voting member of the committee that works on Standard 100. So I have one and I am not allowed to share it. But it will be an important piece that we'll make sure that the people who are working on the adaptation of Standard 100 have access to the content so that we can effectively use it.
And then, yeah, and then I'll mention too, so as we go through our rulemaking process, we'll be integrating our Oregon specific requirements into the Standard 100 language. So like those sections of 100, as we work on them, will be part of our rule review. And then after we're done with our rules and we have the integrated Oregon version that takes Standard 100 and modifies it for Oregon, and come up with, you know, that complete package, that complete document, that will be available on our website for download for the Oregon integrated version of it for free. But, you know, that'll only be complete after we're done with our rules. So like the Oregon version of Standard 100 will be there for free at the end of our process. So that's it. Yeah, for me. So yeah, feel free to continue, Sean. I don't think I see any other questions in there now. Oh, I do see. So Washington State posted a copy on their website during the rulemaking. I'll have to see. I know we have a licensing agreement with ASHRAE for it. I can definitely ask to see if that's something that's possible under our licensing agreement. I don't want to, you know, promise anything if that's something that ASHRAE wouldn't be okay with our agreement. But I can definitely look into that.
And there was a question about ISO 500001, and my understanding is that is a good way to think about that would be an international version of Standard 100, or not. I don't want to give the impression that it's like an adapted version of Standard 100, but it's like Standard 100 in its purpose, but it's from a more international perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sean, do you have additional slides to go through, or are we kind of at the question and answer portion?
Nope, we really wanted to keep this high level as an introduction for people to the standard and not overwhelm them with a lot of details. So as we move through this process, we of course always are going to welcome questions, and so we can move on to our next item.
Okay. Great. Okay, yeah, so the last item on the agenda is just kind of closing and next steps and opportunity for Q&A. And I've gone through the, I've tried to go through some of the questions that were asked during my portion and answer those. So hopefully if you asked a question, I know it's a little bit clunky in the chat to see like the question and answer, but I tried to list the question first and then provide an answer to it as I went through, but I don't think I got to everything yet. So I'll kind of just try to scan through here and see if there are any. I guess I see one here. So for state agencies that own buildings, we already do much of this for buildings over 5,000 square feet via the SEED program. Will the annual SEED report, so this is for state buildings only, cover this, or will there be additional reporting requirement? So we do have, we do recognize that with building performance standards, a lot of what's required through BPS is already being done at the state level. We are closely looking at opportunities to consolidate that effort so that state agencies don't need to like double report and we want to reduce the amount of duplicate work required. So yeah, we're really looking into streamlining that, maybe reducing the state building SEED report activities if they're covered buildings under the BPS. You know, for some of those buildings that are under the BPS threshold, but over what we typically track through state agency usage, 5,000 square feet and above, we'll probably still want to keep tracking those. But I think there's an opportunity to consolidate for sure. Let's see, just scanning through if there's any questions. That I haven't answered yet. I'll kind of go back up to the top. There's a question about where will the RFPs be listed? So those would be listed on Oregon Buys once they're posted. If you've signed up to receive notifications from the state procurement system, Oregon Buys, that's where they'll be listed. Are we still adding to the rulemaking advisory committee? The committee for the tier 1 buildings is set, but we do want to get input on the tier 2 rulemaking advisory committee. And just a note too, you know, if you're not on the rulemaking advisory committee for tier 1 buildings, and the rulemaking that we're doing this year, you know, not just tier 1, but all the rulemaking we're doing this year, but still wanted to monitor that RAC activity, those will be open to the public too. And there's definitely the opportunity to comment, and we don't want to certainly don't want to limit input on our rulemaking to just the members of the committee. It's open to, you know, we'll consider just as much members that aren't on the committee too. There's a question about every state agency is under order from the governor under Executive Order 2004 to exercise any and all authority and discretion to reduce greenhouse gas pollution by 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. How will ODO prioritize decisions in the rulemaking to ensure this program follows that order? So yeah, I think this question kind of goes back to what I was covering at the beginning of the presentation, where programs like building performance standards are you know, policies that help address like one component of state energy use and achieving that goal. So when we look at all of the different policies to help us get to that goal of 80% reduction below 1990 levels, like you look at like the clean electricity requirements, DEQ's climate protection program, our energy codes, energy appliance standards, clean fuels, transportation, like what impact will what effect will each of those programs have on our state energy and greenhouse gas emissions? You know, then you have to consider what else is needed to help us get to the goals. So building performance standards was really the policy that kind of rose to the top for existing buildings to cover existing buildings component of our statewide greenhouse gas emissions to help us close that gap to where we need to be. It was part of a legislative task force requirement, an interim task force that occurred before the 2023 session. So, you know, I think, you know, certainly through our implementation of the BPS, it addresses emissions from existing buildings. You know, we're limited and directed to looking at site energy use, but certainly setting those targets will help reduce energy use, which in turn help reduce greenhouse gas emissions from buildings. And that's kind of how we're prioritizing our outlook and framework of the program to help get to those greenhouse gas reduction goals. We see it as a critical component to helping our state get there. I see a question about how will data be received from the building owners? It will be primarily reported through, the plan is to have it reported through Energy Star Portfolio Manager, and then have our database, our BPS database, kind of overlay and extract data from Portfolio Manager. Portfolio Manager is kind of the standard in the industry. I think most folks it's free. You know, a lot of building owners are familiar with it if they've ever reported their energy use to, like the city of Portland that uses commercial, or that has a commercial building benchmarking program, or if they've applied for an Energy Star score. It's kind of the standard in the industry, so we're hoping to leverage that. Let's see. I'm trying to scan through. Let's see. I don't know. It's kind of hard to see questions that I haven't answered, but I'll certainly go through the chat afterward, and if there's any that I haven't answered, try to answer those. Oh, medical office buildings, healthcare but not hospital, fall under tier 1 or tier 2. Oh no, I don't think I answered that one yet. At this point, I think those would actually be a tier 1 building, classified under more of an office building, not a hospital. As long as it is just like a separate and distinct office type building and doesn't actually include any sort of like healthcare activities in it. What are the alternatives for campuses that do not have building level metering? This is something that we're interested in hearing from stakeholders as we go through our process for sure. I think some other jurisdictions have applied a campus level approach as a potential pathway for compliance, where you might have like 1 or 2 meters that cover multiple buildings. So we're definitely interested in exploring that as a pathway as we go through our process. Let's see if there are, I think I've addressed most of the questions. Wendy, if you see any questions in there that maybe I haven't gotten to, that would be helpful too. And like I mentioned, I'll go through and make sure that I haven't missed any too. There's a question about who's on the rulemaking committee. I posted organizations that are on the committee on there too. How will Odo prioritize energy efficiency compliance pathways through the building performance standard that not only cut down on energy waste, but also improve indoor air quality, provide efficient heating and cooling, and protect against outside air pollution for workers, customers, and others who gather in these commercial buildings? So the thing with building performance standards, the primary pathway is really just a performance target itself. It's an EUI, site energy use performance target, and the method to get there is there's a lot of methods to get there. It's flexible in its nature in terms of what measures a building owner or a building occupant chooses to implement to get to that target. So I don't know that we'll necessarily have any like real specific prioritization on the measures that help get there, but certainly hope and recognize that a lot of the measures that reduce energy also have those non-energy benefits, like improved indoor air quality and comfort, and weatherization, and limiting outdoor air pollutants from getting in a building, and better ventilation, better filtration. I think that's all the questions that I'm seeing now. So yeah, I do see some clarification. So on the medical office building, so that's something that we'll look at through our rulemaking too. I see building owners need accessible customer support with the process, which appears to be cost intensive for the owners. So I think if that's referring to like just having questions about the customer support for questions about a building performance standard or questions about how to report, it's certainly in our plans to offer a help desk to support building owners with that sort of activity. Let's see. Are you going to open it up to the hands that are raised to voice questions? Yeah, I think we can. Are folks able to raise their hands? I don't know that I see any hands that are raised right now, but yeah, it looks like there's one. Tim Miller. There you go. I think I just unmuted you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
I can, yeah. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks for all this great info. My name is Tim Miller. I'm the director of Oregon Business for Climate, and we're really excited about seeing a successful implementation of this program. As I understand it, the rules explicitly are already structured, and I may not have totally tracked everything you covered earlier, but to focus on actions that save money for businesses and owners involved over time, right? So first off, I want to say that's really good news for everybody in this sector, that it creates opportunities for clean buildings professionals and construction folks and installers and everybody else to have this wave of activity. I don't see those folks on slide 36 in the stakeholders list. It might be worth considering adding those folks, but I do know some of those folks have that perspective on the RAC. But I just want to emphasize that this jobs and economy benefit is really an important consideration in terms of the overall impact of this program. So bear that in mind. And then second, again, given that this thing is designed to save money for folks, it seems that I guess for some building owners and others who don't already see the co-benefits of these investments and the fact that they're going to save money on it, the only hurdle might be finding the upfront capital to capturing these savings and benefits. So relating to that upfront cost, I have sort of basically three questions. One is, how are you thinking about prioritizing the initial incentive fund for the early adopters and owners? Two, are you starting to think about any complementary policies to support those investments that you might recommend to legislators or just in ODO programming? And three, how might we leverage federal funds to help address these capital needs?
Yeah, those are all great questions and great points. I probably don't have very complete answers at this point, but we did get as far as incentives for early adoption and early or involuntary compliance, there was a $2 million budget allocated to us for incentives. You can imagine that amount doesn't stretch all that far across potentially thousands of buildings that need to comply. So as far as prioritization goes on that, I think we'd probably look to potentially applying it to, maybe buildings that need the most help, or maybe historically underserved, disadvantaged type communities that maybe need that, that could benefit from that assistance. Leveraging other sources, we have started to explore other federal funding sources to maybe supplement what's been given to us at the state level, to maybe provide other incentives, both for building measures and energy efficiency measures to be implemented, and then also to potentially support workforce development and getting auditors trained to be able to provide these high quality audits that result in meaningful audits that building owners can rely upon to make their efficiency investments.
And I can see. I can see.
Address your questions. Yeah.
I think so. I mean, I can see that ODO could capture more money to help increase these incentives and all that. I'm partly wondering, or maybe just suggesting, we also think about how can ODO help business owners directly tap IRA money that is designed to help buildings do this work, outside of money that ODO might land through CPRG or whatever. There's going to need to be some hand-holding for businesses and a ton of federal money, to help them tap those dollars. So fill out this form here. Here's the link. Here's how to do it. Here's the help desk to fill out the form to get the money. That's what I'm suggesting.
Yeah, it's a great suggestion. We're certainly open to helping out all that we can. We're fortunate to have this amount of federal funding kind of coming in at the same time. I think a lot of the federal funding is residentially focused. We're kind of recognizing that there's not as much that's commercially focused. Great for the residential sector, but maybe not as many opportunities on the federal funding commercially. But some of it's still there, and to the extent that we can help connect building owners with that, we're definitely interested in that.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. So yeah, those are definitely good points. And thanks, I appreciate the perspective. I see questions about when the HEPDAS will go live. So Portland building owners are up against the spring deadline for the city's requirements. So I do just want to clarify that the state's benchmarking and compliance requirements aren't for a few years. So our help desk would be more aligned with the state's program. I know the city of Portland's doing all that they can to get folks to prepared and ready to report for that program, but our help desk wouldn't necessarily be aligned with the city's upcoming spring requirement, unfortunately. There's a question about, will the help desk be Oregon staff or will there be an RFP for this? I think it'll end up being some kind of a combination, most likely. I don't know if there'll be a separate RFP, but we will be hiring staff to help support and provide outreach and education. But I anticipate that there'll need to be some, particularly at the program start, when we have thousands of buildings and building owners getting acclimated to the requirements, it might be more than just our limited staff can handle. So there might need to be some kind of like ramp up supplemental help desk support that we look to a third party to help provide. If anyone else has a raised hand, certainly feel free to do that. I think we have about 10 more minutes left on our timeline. I do see just a comment there about Washington found their incentives are not sufficient to cover the upfront cost of audits, let alone the cost to do some improvements. Yeah, we keep in pretty, occasional close contact and with the folks in Washington to kind of learn from them. We're fortunate to be able to go through, to have their experience to inform our experience. And we've heard similar challenges with the Washington incentive program. So I'm happy to answer any questions if there are any. If anyone wanted to raise their hand and ask it. Not seeing any, but happy to hang on for a little while longer. All right, I guess going once, going twice. Okay, well, thanks everybody for attending today. Hopefully it was informative and you learned a little bit more about building performance standards and Oregon's process. And thanks, Sean, for going over ASHRAE 100 to give folks a general idea of that. Feel free to submit comments, please do, on using the comment portal or any other email myself. Thanks a lot for attending. Thanks, Sean. Any closing words, Sean, from your end?
Thank you, everyone, for attending, and please stay engaged.
Yes, agreed. All right. Have a nice day.